Hi, I'm Michael Karcher. I teach human development most semesters. This semester I'm not teaching, but I wanted to share some ideas about the SONI scale, the Self-Objects Need Inventory scale, and the theory behind it. So what I want to do today is open up a PowerPoint that I'll share with your instructor and then introduce you to this construct and the measure. And I know you're going to get scores for your responses on that measure and several other measures later on in the semester. So this should serve as an introduction to self-psychology and also provide a introduction to the scale and how to be thinking about it, especially how to think about it relative to other content that you've got this in this course. The self-psychology fits nicely in between the attachment theory and the late childhood period. And I'm hoping that the information that I'll share with you today will help you see how self-psychology provides a unique lens to the other theories and fills in some gaps that they have left. So I'm uploading PowerPoint, and this PowerPoint will try to address constructs in a Word document that you've been sent. The Word document is called Self-Object Needs in Kohut's Self-Psychology. It's a 5-page handout with some key terms taken from that Benai article that describes the scale. It's a really dense article. So my goal is to walk through that, give you some of the constructs that are in there, and introduce you to why I think self-psychology provides something really useful for many practitioners. So we'll start that now. And jot down questions you have as we go through. You're welcome to email those to me collectively or individually, and then we can have a dialogue about these constructs. Okay, trying to here we go. Grab your handout. You may have these PowerPoint slides as well. And we'll start now. So what this theory allows us to do, it creates a bridge in between Erikson's 8 stages, showing the psychodynamic relevance of some of the constructs that he describes. It'll build on the attachment work you've already done, attachment theory work, and then it will lead into, if your class is discussing this, defenses, psychological defenses, and Freud's theory, as well as help you understand the importance of attachment leading to autonomy, which is the Erikson term, autonomy versus shame and doubt, and how autonomy is required before initiative can really take hold and take place. So we're going to spend a little time talking about attachment, but actually mostly at the end. I'll try to differentiate attachment issues from self-development issues, or self-deficits, we'll call them, as well as personality disorders. And then we'll also, midway through the talk about how the self-psychology helps us understand the importance of autonomy, its relevance in shame. And then a really interesting thing you'll notice is that in the descriptions by Erikson, the second stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt, shame becomes a core emotion, and it's very different than the one that follows, right? Initiative versus guilt. And I will describe how initiative and guilt are related to the traditional conflict and neurotic conflict that Freud introduced, and how self-deficits reflect something really important for you as a practitioner to know about the role of shame and where we go from attachment on our way to initiative through a period of autonomy development. And I'll describe that. And I'll start by talking about 4 psychologies in the psychodynamic tradition. So we go to the second slide. Now, what I'm talking about here, I'll introduce you to, is a book by Fred Pine called Drive, Ego, Object, Self. And there's also a couple of articles about it. And I want to introduce to you what he is sort of suggesting. He, in his book, in his article, describes how the field of psychodynamic psychotherapy, which I won't go into here regarding its relevance and importance or its impact empirically in terms of being a viable treatment method, equally efficacious behavioral and cognitive approaches for sure. How about every 25 years, there was a new emergence in the field of the psychodynamic psychotherapies. Initially, it was Freud with his drive psychology, then Anna Freud with her ego psychology. Then there were several object relations theorists, and then what we'll describe as self-psychology by Kohut and Winnicott. The most important thing I want to share with you is that this shift allows us to have 2 key terms to be thinking about. And although I really like a lot of what the object relations theorists, including Erickson, talk about, today we're going to focus on conflicts versus deficits and what those mean. And I'll introduce a pair of weird terms right now. Freud's idea of conflicts centers around what he calls the Oedipal drama, a 3-person drama of the King Oedipus and his unknown to him mother and father, who were the king, the queen that he lusted after, and the king that he killed, not knowing that they were his parents. Those 3 people create tremendous guilt in the story of Oedipus, guilt because he killed his father. And those 3 people reflect the tripartite 3-element model of guilt and neurotic guilt and the essence of conflict. You've got 2 things, and you're trying to use one resolution for 2 things, and no resolution seems to work for both of those other parties or those other relationships or ideas. So that is the origin of talk therapy, the idea that I'll introduce in a second. But what comes before that developmentally, this is a human development class, before the ability to see conflict is the importance of the differentiating self. And if a self doesn't differentiate and become sufficiently autonomous for a variety of reasons, either early in childhood or later in life, we have what we're going to call pre-Oedipal. That is, problems in the emergence of an autonomous, cohesive self that reflect deficits in the provision of certain relational ingredients. We're going to call those the self-object needs. That's what the measure, the SONI, captures. 3 particular self-object needs. And in the absence of those being met, deficits emerge that one then responds to through an organization of the self toward meeting those needs or defending against them. And I want to talk about that tonight with you. So we'll come back to this idea of conflict and deficits. Let me just step back and again give you that introduction to the work of Pine. Fred Pine, in his Drive, Ego, Object, Self, illustrates that over time there were these 4 psychologies that all reflect the essence of psychodynamic theories, where there are unconscious elements driving motivation and behavior. Theorists for the different theories, Sigmund Freud, and there were others of the traditional psychoanalytic ilk, who talked about the id, ego, and superego. And then Anna Freud, who did additional work and focused on our understanding of the mechanisms of defense. Later on, in the 50s to the 70s, there were folks who were also psychodynamically oriented, but who viewed patterns in expectations and roles in relationships as being fundamental and critical. Sullivan, Bowlby, Erickson, Klein, all of these folks talked about patterns of being and relating with others that constitute the object relations theorists. But it was in the 70s and 80s that Kohut, Winnicott, formed what has become self-psychology by looking at a type of pathology and problem that wasn't addressed well by prior theorists, either by the object relations. Probably Melanie Klein got the closest to being able to address some of this pre-Oedipal stuff that happens in the first couple of years, theoretically. But it was Winnicott and Kohut, who were both pediatricians who learned tremendous amounts through observation of mothers and children about the development of children. So I've lost the top of my slide. I'm sorry about that. It didn't look that way in the PowerPoint. Basically, as contributions to self-psychology. I'm sorry, to drive psychology. So the drive psychology, Freud's model, the thing that's important for us to be thinking about in terms of understanding conflicts are the two models that he introduced. One is the topographical model, which showed levels of availability consciously to beliefs, feelings, wishes, but particularly beliefs about the self and other. What was conscious is what we know and we're aware of. What's preconscious is information that we don't think of at the moment, but we could draw our attention to it. We're not blocking it, but it's not in our mind at the present time. But it's the unconscious material, memories, wishes, beliefs, fantasies, goals, feelings. It's the unconscious that wants to bubble up and it wants to free itself, but there's a conflict that pushes it down. Now, if in this class or another class you have been introduced to the work of George Vaillant, you'll understand that ego psychology and the study of the defenses, and in his book, The Wisdom of the Egos, is really a wonderful presentation of this. He describes not just the id, ego, and superego, which was the original model, three organizations of the mind, id, ego, and superego, not just those three in conflict, but he suggests that there are other sources, four primary sources of conflict that lead to defenses. One are, impulses and drives and hunger, sex, those sort of original psychoanalytic ones, aggressive and sexual instincts. But involving and incorporating the work of the object relations theorist, he talked about how social expectations and one's conscience really develop from an awareness of what's expected and what people who we care about expect us to do and how they expect us to act. And so there are conventions and roles and relationships and expectations. And there's the pressure of these social relationships that lead us to act in certain ways and to block certain information. It's not all about aggressive and sexual instincts. It's about what we know is right and wrong in society, and then also what we know people who we care about expect from us, and the roles that we find ourselves in with them, and even dramatic, unexpected changes in reality. You find yourself in a natural disaster. You experience a traumatic assault. These things radically shift your view of the world, and the outside becomes unpredictable, and you have to defend against it. There are a variety of things that cause us to distort reality. And George Vaillant, in his work, talks about these. But he and others have organized the defenses into 4 groups that you may talk about later in the semester or may have covered in other courses. 4 types of defenses. Now, the most distorting, often based on or resulting from biological origins or disturbances, are the psychotic defenses. Complete breaks with reality, trauma, and even schizophrenia and other biological disorders, bipolar, can lead to psychotic distortions in reality. And I won't talk about those so much. I want to focus on the next 2, what we call immature and neurotic defenses, because it's the distinction between these 2 where we find the value of the self object needs, and where self-psychology offers us a lens for working with people that other theories, even the psychodynamic ones, really don't. So let me talk about the neurotic conflicts. Again, those neurotic conflicts are what we're most familiar with. They're the origin of talk therapy, that if we can provide supportive, encouraging, safe context for people to talk about their feelings and experiences where they won't feel judged and they'll feel empowered to be able to speak their whole self, that we can help them overcome the blocks that they have to allowing thoughts, feelings, and actions to emerge into consciousness and quit being blocked for whatever reason. That talk therapy is great and works well for these neurotic defenses. Now, these neurotic defenses are all pretty much in our head. We rearrange emotions, ideas, beliefs, information. If you talk about defenses later in your course, you'll see more about this. But these are all how we attach ownership to feelings, beliefs, perceptions, and how we mix those up in our mind. But they're not external, they're internal. You can have neurotic conflicts in your car while you're driving to work, right? Because it's about how you're organizing your beliefs and understandings and how you're attributing motivations and feelings to people as a function of you're trying to find some resolution for those competing conflicts. But it's in these immature defenses where we find the self-psychology so helpful. The immature defenses develop before the neurotic defenses. The immature defenses are what we're going to describe in a second as 2-person problems, because they emerge out of unsatisfactory 2-person relationships, parent-child typically, and the defenses are themselves dependent on there being relationships. That is, you can't engage in the immature defenses like projection if there's not somebody there to be projected upon, or displacement if there's not something or someone present to be displaced upon. The immature defenses reflect deficits in earlier needs. And when I say earlier, I mean needs prior to the development of an independent, separate, cohesive, autonomous self. In the absence of what Erickson would call an autonomous self, there is intense vulnerability to shame and doubt. And the immature defenses reflect chronic methods or means of trying to control other people, which is why the immature defenses bind user and object, that is the user of the defense and the object that they are engaged with, in intense, irritating distortions where the user of the defense, the person with the self-deficit typically, is acting in a way that demands the other person experience the world in a specific way so that they can feed off of that. So the immature defenses are quite controlling, and one often feels as if they've been sort of controlled by the other person or bound to them in some way because of the intensity of the distortion. So when I say that these are developmental, if you look at psychotic, there is a parallel that can be drawn between the infant who has no sense of reality, who doesn't really differentiate self and other, internal and external, because they haven't got the cognitive or emotional development yet to do that. Then there is the immature defenses, where the person is completely dependent on the other. And that's actually normal for young children, ages 2, 3. They are completely dependent on the other. And they are developing a sense of who they are and how they feel about themselves, their worth, in a sense, based on how other people treat them. But over time, we internalize the good interactions with caregivers and some of the bad ones to know that we have both good and bad parts of ourselves, but we can see how we are distinct from others. And that autonomous self, a self that doesn't depend on what other people view it to be, that independence from others allows us to be an intact, cohesive self. And that's required for that self to have conflicts between two other rival things. So the neurotic conflicts can't emerge until a cohesive self is present. And then the neurotic conflicts emerge. And then later on, there are the mature defenses, which maybe you'll talk about later in your course, where there are distortions, like with all defenses, of reality, of emotion, but they are minimal. They're typically pre-conscious. And the way that they distort the world typically enhances relationships, strengthens relationships, or allows difficult feelings to be reused and twisted or viewed in a unique way that allows them to make a unique contribution, such as through art, to society. So we have a key concept, which is conflicts that can emerge once we have an autonomous self, and we have deficits. Sorry, the formatting is a little whacked off. It didn't look that bad in the PowerPoint. So 3-person conflicts, you can think id, ego, and superego as the 3, or you can think of Oedipus and the queen and king as the 3 people involved, where the conflict is trying to find some resolution that meets multiple role obligations an individual has. But deficits, 2-person deficits, are different. They reflect chronic needs that were not met. And I guess I should pause quickly and say, even though we're talking about this as a process that occurs leading up to the development of an autonomous self, 2 things are worth noting. One is that the autonomous self, the self in general, is a living thing, and it can be damaged. So an individual could have a fairly cohesive self and emerge into adolescence even, and then experience a traumatic encounter, something that radically rips apart, tears away their faith in society, their faith in themselves, their sense of themselves being good. It evokes a great shame, and in doing that, puts them back into a position of needing to draw on others to counter those feelings of shame and doubt. So a variety of traumatic experiences throughout life can throw one back to the point which they need to draw on people again in the way that Kohut describes, in order to develop a cohesive self that can be autonomous, independent, and fairly robust to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Hamlet. Now, just to give a bit of a background, I want to just introduce Winnicott, who I just saw a second ago. I misspelled Winnicott here in this next slide. You'll see Winnicott. Sorry about that, Winnicott. So Winnicott has a quick way of describing this. When the child, very young, experiences narcissistic omnipotence, as all children will, when they feel all powerful with their agency, sometimes they exert their demandingness and they are shut down. If they are shut down such that when they exhibit their grandiosity and their power and their excitement in themselves and are shut down, sometimes the children will respond in a way which evokes what we call a false self, a way of being in relationships that is always pretending as a way to create in others the feelings that they need the others to have. They're performing for the other people. Whereas through the process of what we'll later call the good enough mother and also something called the transitional object, but through the good enough mother's example we use today, where there are disappointments and frustrations that are small, but they are enough that they allow the child opportunities to internalize and take on the self-care functions that parents typically provide for the young child. That allows the child to experience small doses of adversity, not unlike a vaccine, to have a little opportunity to battle small challenges that could otherwise be overwhelming. And in Winnicott's point of view, sometimes they are overwhelming, and they lead an individual to abdicate their independence for a sense that they are compliant and dependent on others and need to perform for others and draw others' attention through being and acting and appearing in ways others want them to be. That's the false self. That results from an insufficient period of allowing this omnipotent fantasy of strength and power that young children all have and need to allow to be expressed and then also tamed through these experiences of struggle and disappointment by the parent. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, contrary to Winnicott, Kohut went so far as to identify the ways in which that true or false self might emerge and to look specifically at the needs. He saw that there were folks, particularly folks who suffer from the personality disorder of narcissism, that they didn't do well with talk therapy. They didn't take well when the therapist would provide insightful interpretations of some of their defenses, as Freud would have suggested be done in the traditional talk therapy. Instead, they felt criticized and shamed as a result of those interpretations. And as a result, they would reject the therapist and abandon the therapy. So they weren't well met by that talk therapy approach. And Winnicott realized that what they needed was not insight, and not, at least not immediately, but they needed empathic responding that would actually serve to compensate for prior experiences of a lack of some basic needs for empathy, praise, attention, consistent structure. And I'll talk about those needs. And that he felt that therapy was more about creating an experience of those early developmental needs being met. And that was needed to mobilize the self in the reconstruction of an autonomous self. And that must occur well before one begins to realize conflicts that need interpretation to move into the conscious awareness, because for those things, for some self to have an awareness of multiple ways of viewing themselves, they have to have a self that is stable and consistent. It's the harbinger, it's the basic seed of identity development, of an identity, a sense of who I am that's consistent across people and places. And so for that to occur, there are some experiences that individuals need to have. Now, he calls these three poles or axes because he sees them as interactive. I'm going to introduce them in kind of the casual way I like to describe them, less using his terms. So let me first describe them this way. The three poles or axes, for me, are about individuals receiving empathy, praise, and attention, as well as clear, consistent structure. They need the experience of, I can. That allows a sense of ambition to result from others affirming their importance and their power. It's that grandiosity. It's that sense of, you're important, you're worth looking at, you're worth listening to, you're worth watching. like watching you. I enjoy seeing you. That I can do something. I can be this is essential for self-esteem. But then once that is present, there's also I can do what? I should do something. I should do this, not that. Having goals and values and an idealized self um, to move toward is critical for identity development. Here's how I want to be. This is what I believe, and I'm going to act in ways that are consistent with that. That requires that there has been another person who was consistent and clear, sufficiently so that the person could trust them and see what they are about and could see them as predictable and reliable. Ideally, it's one parent or both parents who are both empathic, attentive, praising, encouraging, and they are reliable and consistent and a source of strength and safety. Sometimes it's two parents, one does the other. Sometimes it's one parent. But if you have a parent who loves their child and validates them and praises them, but has addiction or personality disorder or some other circumstances that cause them to act in erratic and inconsistent ways, then they fail to provide this second function of here's how I should be. A strong person is this way, and they value these things. So the I should becomes unclear, and their goals become diffuse, and they don't know what to do or who to rely on or who to trust. And so then they crave someone who they can idealize as being a source of strength and power. And then the last one is I am. After feeling I can and I should, I have a sense of worth and a sense of purpose. And then there is the what do I do well, and how do I find myself in circles of people who value that, like that, so that I can continue to receive empathy, praise, attention in a reliable and consistent manner. And that's where the twinship needs emerge, the connection with others that form. So the third of these is the connectedness that emerges from when one identifies their skills and talents from what they've observed from others and the feedback they've gotten from people who value them. It allows them to then have a sense of connection with larger groups and commitments. And that then allows this cycle. If you see, this cycle starts with one, empathy, praise, and attention, fosters ambition. He calls this mirroring, the validation, the showing someone who they are and how important they are and how worthwhile they are and how loved they are. That's the mirroring. When that happens, we typically look to that person or people connected to that person for idealizing. It's who we can idealize as powerful and strong and start to act like them and take on their beliefs and who is it who can reassure us, who can calm us, who can soothe us. Those are the folks that we start to emulate and become like. We idealize them. That's the number two pole, the idealization pole. When that's present, then we realize something. People like us for certain traits and things we do, and those people have certain values themselves that we accept. So when you combine those, you find skills and talents emerge, and we start to move into communities. And you see a cycle where it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And throughout life, we are constantly, every day, we're entering relationships, and to a greater or lesser extent, we receive empathy, praise, and attention from the people we meet with. And if we receive empathy, praise, and attention, we tend to then like these people. And if they're consistent in that and they're trustworthy, and we feel safe around them, we tend to idealize them and accept their values and beliefs. And we then start to cultivate talents and skills that reflect the things that we receive empathy and praise and attention for, and that people that we trust value. And we have this connectedness with others. And that becomes the basis of our identity and our community. And then we begin to do this cycle again, 1 through 3, over and over again, right? So those three needs are mirroring, idealizing, and twinship. They're different functions, often come from the same people, but they are the core experiences, developmental experiences, or what they call in the article provisions that one needs. They take narcissism, which is a good thing in its starting elements. It is good. and allow it to fuel the self, and then attach the self to others, and then attach oneself to communities and beliefs and goals based on who we are. Connects who we are to others in ways that are critical. Now, these needs continue. They don't happen only in the first couple of years of life. They happen throughout life, but they can be bad. They can be problematic. So, for example, there are two types of self-objects. Objects are the targets of those to whom we attach our emotions, the libidinal connection that is narcissism. Narcissism is when we become emotionally invested in ourselves, and we need to. We also become emotionally invested in others, in other objects. We take our emotions, we connect them to others. But we can do so in one of two ways as adults, let's say. As adults, if we continue to basically use others to meet our self-object needs for mirroring, idealizing, and twinship, because we lack a fully differentiated self, because we're dependent upon what others think about us to feel comfortable in our own skin. We lack a sense of cohesion and autonomy that allows us to be independent and separate. So we need others to prop us up. In that way, we enter in relationships and we meet archaic self-object needs. Archaic means like early needs. The 2-year-old is experiencing the parent in a very one-sided way because they are completely dependent on the parent. So they need mirroring, idealizing, and twinship from that person. And they act in ways that try to cultivate it. But then slowly over time, they internalize those functions so that they can perform them for themselves. So as you grow older, if you continue to just pull from others the mirroring, idealizing, and connection experiences you need, relatedness, just so you can feel good about yourself, it's very one-sided, and it becomes manipulative, and it reflects your use of people in adolescence, the way an infant and a very young child uses people. So that early self-object use becomes manipulative and it becomes immature, which is why we call these immature defenses that they use. Whereas in adulthood, mature self-objects are those people from whom we get attention and ideal, but we can weather failures in their responses to us. If we find that they lose attention in us, or they aren't empathic around us, or they are inconsistent with us, and we have a hard time idealizing them as a result, or we experience distance from them where we expect relatedness, we can weather that to some extent because we are cohesive and separate individuals. We can say to ourselves, oh, wow, that person wasn't very nice to me. They were very empathic. There must be something going on for them. Something's happening for them. I can understand they have a separate world, and how they acted is not necessarily a statement about me. It could be about them. What can I do to be caring and supportive of them? How can I provide them strength and support? How can I be empathic towards them? So mature self-objects have a reciprocity to them where, yes, we are drawing from them to know who we are better and to reaffirm how we view ourselves, but we aren't devastated when they don't provide us those early developmental provisions, whereas with the archaic self-object use, we are, because we're totally dependent on them, which is why through immature defenses, we try to control them so that we control the way they respond and the kind of information they give us. Helps us minimize the distortions we need. If we can get people to tell us we're wonderful and that we're strong, or if we can attach to their strength and feel like they have our backs for sure. So taking these constructs into therapy, one example, you get this big nutty word, transmutational internalizations. And it is a funny word. It's a bad word, frankly, because there's got to be a better way. I would say it's the drop the ball phenomenon or something like that. It's a little more concrete and less off-putting. But it's based on the idea, well, it's like Winnicott's good enough mother, where The good enough mother tolerates our grandiosity, also our tirades and tantrums as a child, and is consistent, loving, affirming, available, but starts to drop the ball, fails in some ways, isn't empathic, isn't available, isn't there to protect you or keep you safe. And those empathic failures, we call them in therapy, those caregiving failures when it's a parent, are small enough that it allows the child to step up and take on those roles. They've watched the parent, they know what the parent says to reassure the child, to praise the child, to comfort the child, and the child can use those words themselves. My daughter has done that in ways I always find so interesting when I'll hear her at night talking to herself, telling herself it's going to be okay, or she can do this. That's a way that she's internalized what we've said to her. And in moments when she's feeling frightened or dependent or scared or nervous, she can tell herself those things because she's internalized it, and she is now providing herself those own functions. And the same thing happens in self-psychology in therapy. And that's what the process of transmutational internalization is. It is after an idealization has occurred, and that requires a good deal of empathy, praise, and attention by the therapist. The therapist will carefully manage the times when they fail. They're going to fall. They're going to have faults. They're going to mess up. They're going to do something out of role, say something out of role, not perform in the way that they're expected to, not provide empathy in a way or at the right time. But how they respond to that, to encourage the client to be able to accept a range of self and other perceptions so that people can be seen as both strong and weak, good and bad, that they have grays. They're not all good or bad, that there can be black and white and gray in all people, including oneself. And that modeling process of small empathic failures that are worked through and helped to be tolerated by the client is what this is one of the challenges, and it really is a tool that you need to develop in working with clients, or even sometimes parents of clients. So as we move to the next slide, somehow, there's the next slide. I seem to be stuck. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. A couple of key terms. Sorry again, the font shrunk. That's terrible. This is from the handout that you have. Terms that help you understand the SONI self-object needs. So the self is, and this is from the first page of the handout, is a process or a system that organizes one's subjective or personal experience, right? It's the essence of one's psychological being. It consists of sensations, feelings, thoughts, memories, goals, wishes, fantasies about oneself and the world. That's the self. It's all that we use to understand the world. The self is the initiating center of personality. Consider what this means for Erikson's model. Until you've got a cohesive self, it's hard to take initiative and act, to take direction. Until you have an autonomous self, until that independent self can take action that it needs based on what it wants, irrespective of how people are going to respond. So that, another term, narcissism, that emotional investment in the self, that is the starting point for individuals to develop healthy relationships with others by being able to be interdependent and cooperative and give as much as they take. Now, when self-object needs aren't met, either in early childhood or subsequently, later in life, and the individual does not establish sufficient autonomy, narcissism gets corrupted, and the narcissism becomes expressed as a defensive or pathological condition. And that's where we look at excessive need for empathy, praise, and attention, clear, consistent, the idealizing need, or connectedness. Those three, we would call twinship, those three needs can become excessively needed, and we become dependent on their needs to the point that we sacrifice the needs of others. When you look at the SONI scale, and I'm going to wrap up now, you look at the SONI scale, one of the things you learn is that it isn't just that you have these needs and your awareness of them, but a defense can emerge where you actually avoid those needs. So going up to the top of this slide, those who have strong and archaic self-object needs who attempt to avoid and deny these needs, they seem to suffer from what we call disorder. Feelings of grandiosity, ideas. They have archaic self-object needs to maintain the attention of others. They're hungry for mirroring, and they continue to search for sources of strength and power to connect with. But at the same time, they deny that they have these. And this defensive avoidance is where we start to see some parallels with attachment theory. But it's also, as you'll see, a second set of scales on the SONI measure. You have the three needs, mirroring, idealizing, and twinship, but then you also have denial of those needs. And so you'll have a measure that'll indicate to what extent you deny having these needs. Maybe you don't have those needs, or maybe it's denial. And that's something you have to determine, or you have to sort of parcel out in your work with clients, right? But it does bring us back to connections with Bowlby's work. And we see that Bowlby talked about defensive exclusion and talked about defenses when the parent isn't readily available consistently, when they are anxious. They develop new styles, hunger for then the avoidance. Some children simply write off and they act in ways that suggest you're not going to meet my needs. That's okay. I didn't need you to meet my needs. I don't need that. And that becomes the avoidance style. So I would just conclude with one distinction between attachment issues and self-object needs and personality disorders. And the distinction is there's a parallel between mirroring needs and one who craves, one who has an ambivalent attachment and is highly anxious or preoccupied as an adult in their relationships, needing affirmation of the reliability and presence of the other person. There's also a parallel between one's avoidance of dependence on others, which we call the avoidant attachment, and the avoidant the self-object needs. But the distinction is that in attachment issues, the issues are in relationships with others who are considered to be separate individuals. So there is a starting sense of a cohesive self, and then there's the other, who we have a working model that suggests they're either not going to be readily available, and so I need to be dramatic and draw attention and seek reassurance, that's the anxious attachment, or they're not going to be reliable and responsive to my needs, and so I'm going to write them off being important. But it's people who are our attachment figures, people we are connected to, who we've chosen to rely on, that those attachment needs emerge with. They don't emerge in all relationships, with your neighbor, with the mailman, with the person at the post office. They're specific generally to people we care about and who we expect will care about us. And we have a working model of expectations about them. Whereas self-object needs, and particularly when those high self-object needs, those archaic self-object needs become chronic and lead to personality disorders. But anywhere along that spectrum, what we observe is that those needs for attention and praise and strength and power, those needs are pervasive. They're not just with attachment figures, they're with everybody. And so in every relationship, we are trying to be affirmed and praised and loved and show that we're powerful, and we only hang out with people who are powerful, and people like us because we're powerful. that idealizing need. So it's pervasive across relationships. It's chronic. It's a part of your personality, that that's the way you view all others. There's you with your needs, known or unknown, and there are others who are need meters to you. That matters not whether they are intimate or not. So much is across the board. So hopefully this sets the stage for your thinking about some of these functions and phenomena. And I would just end by saying again, some of this stuff emerges from early relationships and patterns that develop, and some happens later. There are all sorts of assaults and traumas and rejections that we receive in society. Society is rough. Culture, class, gender, and the experiences that go along with those, and difficult experiences we have in relationships with people can really be damaging to us in ways that can take a fairly cohesive self early on and undermine it in ways that therapists need to really be aware of in their work with clients. So hopefully this scale will help you think about yourself and be able to be better informed in your work with others, to understand the value of meeting these needs in therapy as an equally valuable tool to insight and analysis of conflicts, so to speak. Hopefully this is useful to you, and send questions through your professor, and hopefully I can give you some answers if I have them. Thanks so much.